Welcome everyone, and welcome to the FIDE Candidates 2026 coverage here on the channel. The FIDE Candidates Tournament is of course the event that determines who will challenge the reigning world champion, making every single point absolutely critical. We are now through 3 rounds, and the picture at the top is already becoming very interesting. Heading into this round, the standings were extremely tight at the top. After round 3, FIDE no Praggnanandhaa and Javokhir Sindarov share the lead with 2.5 points apiece, making them the co-leaders of the tournament at this early but crucial stage. Just a point behind them, at 1.5 points each, are Praggnanandhaa and Matthias Bluebomb, very much still in the hunt. In the chasing pack, we find Hikaru Nakamura, Anish Giri, Wei Yi, and Andrei Asipenko, all on 1 point, needing to find their footing quickly before the gap becomes too large to close. In this round 3, we had 4 games played in total, and 2 of them were decisive, with the other 2 ending in draws. That means half the field managed to press through for a full point today, and one of those decisive results was absolutely pivotal for the standings. Sindarov defeating Praggnanandhaa with the black pieces to jump to the joint lead. This is the game we are going to be looking at today in full detail. Sindarov, playing black in the Queen's Gambit, declined, gradually outmaneuvered Praggnanandhaa in a complex middle game, exploiting a king that was stranded in the center and generating a ferocious kingside attack that ultimately won by force. It was a deeply instructive game, showing exactly why Sindarov is one of the most dangerous young players in the world right now. So let us not waste any more time, let's get straight into it. Praggnanandhaa, the young Indian prodigy and one of the most exciting attacking players in the world, sits with white pieces against Sindarov, the Uzbek Grandmaster known for his deep preparation and clinical precision. Both players entered this game on 1.5 points, meaning the winner would leap into a share of the lead. A full point was essentially mandatory for both. The Queen's Gambit declined with the Harwitz attack. Characterized by the bishop developing to f4 rather than g5, is a very fashionable line at the top level. Players like Magnus Carlsen and FIDE no Praggnanandhaa have employed it extensively. White gains a solid pawn structure and fluid piece activity, while black must carefully navigate the tension in the center and find active counterplay. Praggnanandhaa opens with the queen's pawn, signaling his intention to fight for central control in a classical fashion and inviting a variety of complex structures. Sindarov immediately stakes his claim in the center with the symmetrical reply, heading towards solid Queen's Gambit territory and declaring he will not be pushed around. The Queen's Gambit pawn offer, a move played countless millions of times. Challenging the d5 pawn and aiming to gain central space and open lines for the pieces, Sindarov declines the gambit by supporting the d5 pawn with the e-pawn, accepting a slightly cramped but extremely solid structure, the hallmark of the Queen's Gambit, declined. Knight to c3, developing naturally and adding another defender to the d5 square, while also preparing to put pressure on the center with future pawn moves. The bishop drops back to e7, a modest but very solid developing move, preparing to castle kingside and keeping the position flexible without committing to any sharp lines just yet. Knight to f3, completing development of the kingside minor pieces and preparing the way to castle, while also controlling the e5 and d4 squares in the center. Sindarov develops his knight to f6, mirroring white's development, adding a defender to the d5 pawn and setting up the classical QGD tabia that both sides know deeply. And here it is, the Harwitz attack. Instead of the traditional bishop to g5, Praggnanandhaa places his bishop on f4, a more modern interpretation. This bishop is extremely well placed, targeting the c7 square and avoiding the typical Lasker-style exchanges with knight to e4 and knight to d7 that black often uses to relieve pressure in the classical bg5 systems. Sindarov castles kingside, getting his king to safety before any complications arise in the center, a fundamentally sound decision in this position. Praggnanandhaa solidifies the pawn chain with e3, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing to complete development of the remaining pieces, keeping the position very structured and controlled. A very important central break by Sindarov. Black strikes at the white pawn center immediately, trying to create imbalances and generate the kind of active counterplay that is essential in the QGD. If black is too passive, white's bishop pair can become dominant. Praggnanandhaa captures on c5, accepting the exchange of pawns and inviting black to recapture with the bishop, which will open the game for the white bishops. Sindarov recaptures with the bishop, placing it on an active central square and immediately contesting the light squares, with the bishop eyeing the f2 pawn and the kingside. A key prophylactic move, Praggnanandhaa prepares to advance the b-pawn to b4, chasing the bishop away from c5 while also preventing any future knight jumps to b4. Sindarov develops his knight to c6, placing it on an excellent central square where it supports the d5 pawn and eyes the e5 and d4 squares for future activity. The queen comes to c2, a standard Hurwitz attack motif, lining up on the c-file and preparing to castle queenside in some variations, while also controlling the e4 square and keeping the bishop on f4 well supported. Sindarov places his rook on the e-file, a prophylactic and flexible move that prepares the e5 pawn break and puts the rook on the open file that is likely to matter most. Praggnanandhaa switches his bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6 and creating threats, but this also changes the character of the position significantly from the pure Hurwitz setup. A stunning central pawn thrust by Sindarov. Black advances the d-pawn all the way to d4, blowing open the center and immediately creating massive complications. This move attacks the knight on c3 and threatens to undermine white's entire pawn structure. Praggnanandhaa captures on f6, exchanging bishop for knight to relieve the pressure somewhat, but now black gets to recapture with the queen and gain a powerful centralized queen with tempo. Sindarov recaptures with the queen, placing it on a dominant f6 square where it eyes both flanks simultaneously, while the d4 pawn still creates enormous pressure on white's position. Knight leaps to e4. An ambitious try to fight for central dominance and challenge the powerful black queen, while also hitting the bishop on c5. The queen retreats to f5, maintaining pressure and keeping an eye on the e4 knight while staying active, a very precise move that avoids any forced exchanges that would relieve white. Praggnanandhaa pushes forward aggressively, attacking the bishop on c5 and trying to gain space on the queenside, but this creates a very sharp situation where material will soon be flying off the board. Sindarov captures the b4 pawn with the knight, a brilliant tactical decision. He sacrifices the knight temporarily and will gain the bishop pair along with the a3 pawn, giving him enormous compensation. Praggnanandhaa is forced to recapture with the a-pawn, and now the bishop on c5 is free to come to b4 with check, forcing the white king into a very uncomfortable situation. Bishop captures on b4 with check. This is the key point of black's combination. The white king is now forced to move, and since white cannot castle after this, the king will remain dangerously exposed in the center for the rest of the game. The white king steps to d1, the only legal square, and now Praggnanandhaa's king is stuck in the center without any safe refuge, a catastrophic positional concession that Sindarov will exploit ruthlessly. Sindarov captures on e3 with the d-pawn, opening the position further and creating a passed pawn deep in white's territory. The e3 pawn is now a serious structural and tactical problem for Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa develops the bishop to d3, trying to coordinate his pieces and challenge black's bishop on b4, but the situation remains very difficult with the king exposed on d1. The queen repositions to g6, maintaining pressure and eyeing both the g2 pawn and the kingside generally, keeping white's pieces tied down and preventing any meaningful counterplay. Praggnanandhaa recaptures the pawn with the f-pawn, but now the f-file is opened, which could be dangerous for white's king, and the e3 pawn remains a weakness. A powerful pawn thrust, Sindarov advances to f5, gaining space on the kingside and threatening to push further, while also giving the bishop on b4 more room to maneuver. The knight retreats to g3, trying to blockade the f5 pawn and regroup. But white's position is becoming increasingly passive and difficult to coordinate. The bishop returns to c5, a powerful central square where it targets e3 and looks down the long diagonal, keeping maximum pressure on white's fragile king position. This is a significant moment. Praggnanandhaa plays queen to c3, but the engine considers this a mistake, swinging the evaluation decisively in black's favor. White's pieces are becoming too passive, and the queen on c3 does not adequately address black's growing threats on both flanks. Stockfish evaluates the position at around -half a pawn here, signaling that black has seized a meaningful advantage. Sindarov pushes the e-pawn to e5, gaining more space in the center and threatening to advance further with e4, creating a passed pawn roller that will be extremely difficult for white to contain. The bishop retreats to c2, trying to prepare queenside castling of sorts by clearing the d1 square, but white's setup remains awkward with the king on d1 and pieces lacking coordination. The e-pawn marches to e4, and now black has a powerful central pawn mass that is extremely difficult to stop. These pawns are threatening to simply roll forward and overwhelm white's position. Praggnanandhaa brings the knight to d2, trying to blockade the e4 pawn and reorganize his pieces, but the position is becoming increasingly hopeless for white as black's pieces are all active and coordinated. Sindarov activates the other rook by bringing it to d8, placing it on the d-file where it puts pressure on the knight on d2 and prepares to double rooks, adding more fuel to the attack. The white king shuffles to c1, trying to find a slightly safer square, but with rooks coming to d8 and the e4 and f5 pawns advancing, there is no real safety for the white king anywhere. The queen jumps to g5, a very active post where it combines threats against both the g2 pawn and potential mating patterns, while also preparing to swing to e3 to attack the knight on d2. Praggnanandhaa activates the rook on e1, trying to create some counterplay and contest the e-file, but the position remains very difficult for white with so many active black pieces. The queen repositions to e7, a multi-purpose move that covers the e5 pawn, prepares to go to the kingside, and keeps the pressure firmly on white's position without allowing any tactical tricks. The rook moves to e2, doubling pressure on the e-file and trying to create some semblance of defense, but this move also turns out to be somewhat passive given what follows. Sindarov places the bishop on b4, but the engine marks this as a mistake. Black had stronger continuations to press the advantage more decisively. The eval swing here is around 2 pawns, suggesting black let white slightly off the hook with this move rather than pressing with the most incisive continuation. Praggnanandhaa responds with queen to b2, activating the queen and creating some pressure on the queen side, which gives white a brief moment to breathe and try to reorganize. Sindarov advances the a-pawn, gaining queenside space and threatening to push further, but the engine again marks this as a mistake. The eval swing suggests black is not pressing in the most efficient manner and white is given further defensive resources. The knight jumps to b3, attacking the bishop on b4 and the a5 pawns simultaneously, forcing black to react and giving Praggnanandhaa some much-needed activity. The rook goes to a6, defending the a5 pawn and preparing to become active along the 6th rank, but again, the engine considers this less than optimal. Black is not converting the advantage as efficiently as possible, and the eval swing again reflects this imprecision. The knight leaps to d4, an excellent centralized square where it attacks the bishop on b4 and creates tactical complications, giving white genuine counter-chances for the first time in many moves. The queen goes back to g5, maintaining activity and keeping the pressure on white's kingside while waiting to see how the tactical situation around the d4 knight resolves itself. The white king steps to b1, trying to find a safer location and improve the king's position slightly, but the position remains dynamically balanced with both sides having active pieces. Sindarov begins a kingside pawn advance with h5, signaling his intention to create a serious attacking storm on the kingside and giving his position additional long-term resources. Praggnanandhaa marches the king to a2, trying to find safety on the queenside away from any potential rook checks, but this king journey is itself a sign of how uncomfortable white's position has become. The h-pawn advances again to h4, and now Sindarov has a serious kingside pawn storm underway. h4 and f5 together are extremely menacing, and white has no good way to counter this advance. The knight retreats to f1, trying to reposition to d2 or e3 to blockade the advancing pawns, but this passive regrouping shows how white is running out of active ideas. The bishop repositions to d7, a flexible move that prepares to activate along the c6-f3 diagonal and also keeps an eye on the queen side where white's king sits. Praggnanandhaa brings the rook to d1, contesting the d-file and trying to create some counterplay, but black's position remains objectively better with the powerful pawn advances and active pieces. Sindarov repositions the rook to c8, placing it on the semi-open c-file and preparing to create pressure along multiple fronts simultaneously, keeping all his pieces active and coordinated. The knight returns to d2, trying to reorganize and find a better defensive setup, but white's position is rapidly deteriorating as black prepares to mobilize all his forces decisively. The rook swings to b6, placing maximum pressure on the b2 queen and preparing to invade the 7th rank, while also keeping an eye on the queen side where white's king is sheltering. This is a critical mistake by Praggnanandhaa. The engine marks this as a significant error with an evaluation swing of around 1.5 pawns against white. Pushing the c-pawn to c5 looks active, trying to create counterplay and attack the rook on b6, but it fatally overextends white's position and allows Sindarov to launch a decisive combination. Stockfish immediately drops the evaluation to around -2. And the position becomes very difficult to defend. Sindarov captures the c5 pawn with the rook, but the engine marks this as a mistake too. Despite the eval swing suggesting this loses some advantage, black still maintains a significant edge. However, there was a more precise and devastating continuation available that would have been even more decisive. The evaluation remains around -1 for white, so black is still clearly better. Praggnanandhaa plays queen to b3 with check, a desperate attempt to create counterplay and perhaps trick black into a mistake, but the engine considers this another inaccuracy that makes white's situation even worse, with the evaluation now swinging to around -2.7. Sindarov steps the king to h8, getting off the vulnerable g-file and preparing to continue the attack, but notice how the engine swings dramatically here, suggesting black may have had an even stronger reply. The eval swing is enormous at over 5 pawns, indicating white had a brief window that was missed. Praggnanandhaa goes to f7 with the queen, a desperate attempt to create threats and complicate the position, but the engine evaluates this as a serious mistake with a swing of over 2 pawns. The evaluation crashes to around -5, meaning white is now objectively lost, with no practical counterplay remaining. Sindarov responds with devastating force. Sindarov delivers a rook check on c2, a powerful move that sacrifices material temporarily to destroy white's queenside defense. The king on a2 is suddenly very vulnerable, and the combination that follows is completely winning. Notice how this move was found despite the position having enormous complexity. The king retreats to b1, the only move, but now black will collect material with complete domination of the board. Sindarov captures the knight on d2 with the rook. At -5.4, the position is completely winning for black, and white has no compensation whatsoever for the material deficit. Praggnanandhaa recaptures on d2 with the rook, the only available move, but now black will pick up even more material with tempo. The bishop captures on d2 with check, winning a rook and further decimating white's position. The material imbalance is now completely overwhelming, and Praggnanandhaa's position is beyond saving. The king steps back to a2, escaping the check, but the evaluation has crashed to -6.7 as Sindarov continues to collect material and consolidate his enormous advantage. The bishop captures on e3, picking up another pawn and maintaining the overwhelming material advantage. At this point, Praggnanandhaa is simply playing on in the hope that black makes an error, but Sindarov is far too precise. Praggnanandhaa captures on d7 with the queen, trying to generate some threats and complicate the position, but with an evaluation of -5.6, the result is never seriously in doubt. Sindarov captures the knight on d4 with the bishop, winning yet more material and simplifying the position toward a completely winning endgame. The bishop pair, passed pawns, and material advantage are simply too much. Praggnanandhaa captures back with the queen, but the position is hopelessly lost. White is down multiple pawns with no counterplay, and black's pieces are still completely dominant. And with queen to f6, Sindarov centralizes the queen with tremendous force, threatening multiple decisive continuations and making it absolutely clear that Praggnanandhaa has no way to continue the struggle. The game was subsequently resigned, giving Sindarov a full point and propelling him to the joint lead of the FIDE candidates. The decisive factor in this game was Praggnanandhaa's failure to find a safe haven for his king after it was forced to d1 following the spectacular bishop check on b4. Once the white king was stuck in the center, Sindarov methodically built up his attacking forces, and despite some imprecision in the middle game, the Uzbek Grandmaster's clinical technique proved overwhelming in the final phase. And that was round 3 of the FIDE Candidates 2026, a round that saw Sindarov climb to the joint lead alongside Praggnanandhaa with 2.5 points. The tournament is wide open with so many contenders still in striking distance. Round 4 promises to be absolutely fascinating, Who do you think will emerge as the frontrunner? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. See you in the next one.